Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today, we're sitting down to discuss A Different Drummer by William Melvin Kelly. It's the latest book read by Laura's book club, a forgotten classic recently brought back to wider attention by a New Yorker article. We're pairing that up with If Beale Street Could Talk by William Baldwin, which was my last book club read.
Both books are highly thought of, but did they make for good book club books? Listen in to find out. Where to begin? You're stumped.
I don't know. Where do we begin?
Well, I say that because I feel there's so much to discuss.
Well, and
in these two books.
Back-to-back books, yes, exactly.
Oof, and they're very complementary.
We've got a lot to get through, folks.
I must say, I feel a bit unequal to the task.
I felt a bit like that. It does feel like there's a sort of weightiness to both these books, and I felt a bit daunted by the prospect of discussing them on the pod, but then, they're book club books, and what did our book clubs think? This is, I always think what it comes down to, what were they like as novels?
Well, maybe let's start with that. It's a bit reverse, but let's do it. So I got to my book club to discuss A Different Drummer by William Melvin Kelly. As Kate said in our intro, the New Yorker rediscovered this. I mean, is that really fair? But there was an article just a couple of years back now, which brought this back into the popular consciousness, and rightly so. The quote on the front is, "The lost giant of American literature." And I arrived at my book club and we have a general chat ahead of time, and then sort of a bit of a hush fell over the group. And we're like, so what did everyone think? And we're kind of looking around at each other. Who's going to go first? And I don't know who it was, but someone was like, I thought it was amazing. I thought it was bloody brilliant. And we were all like, yes. It's like the most amazing thing I've read in recent history.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, how interesting, because I'm not sure I thought that.
Oh, really? No.
Let's discuss.
I think it's an incredible classic. I think that if it had been published in recent history, it would have won every award. I mean, The Underground Railroad got so much acclaim, and I don't love that book.
Yeah.
But this is on the next level. The Underground Railroad is like poultry compared to this book. There's so much going on here. The structure is so complex. The premise is so original, and we'll get to all of that. But there's also just a real wisdom to his writing, and I thought it should be taught every grade 12 English class across the United States.
Huh. Okay. All right. Well, tell us about it and how you came to choose it.
We came to choose it, I think, just because it was on Phil's radar. He's American, and I think he'd heard a bit about it, and he suggested it, and we were rather sold by the premise. So when we're choosing books in our book club, we usually don't have any suggestions ahead of time, and then we spend about 5 to 15 agonizing minutes on our phones with people suggesting ideas and us unenthusiastically being like, oh, we could do that. And then finally someone will say something and we'll be like, yes.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say what that is, but usually it's something different from what we've read recently. Maybe it's a translation, maybe it's American literature, maybe it's an author we've never discovered before. In this case, Phil was like, there's this book that's just been rediscovered. William Melvin Kelly, the author, died, I think 3 years ago, before it came back as a classic. And he wrote it when he was 23 in 1962. And it did get some attention at the time, but fairly forgotten thereafter. And William Melvin Kelly continued to write, and he did teach creative writing towards the end of his life, and he was a figure on the literary scene, but certainly no household name. The premise of the book, can I read the back cover? Is that cheating?
No, I think so.
It's a very good back cover.
Yeah, go ahead.
June 1957. One hot afternoon in a backwater town in the American South, a young black farmer named Tucker Caliban throws salt on his field, shoots his horse and livestock, sets fire to his house, and departs the state. And thereafter, the entire African-American population leave with him. The reaction to this mass exodus comes from the white townsfolk who remain, every one of whom, whether male or female, young or old, liberal or conservative, bigoted or sympathetic, is grappling with and attempting to explain the spontaneous rejection of subordination.
That's funny, actually. I don't feel like that really kind of sells it to me in a way.
Really?
Well, it's almost like
so original.
No, obviously that premise is really interesting, but then that sounds quite dry, and I think this book is anything but dry, isn't it? It kind of really grabs you straight away with this very dramatic scene of Tucker Caliban. I mean, the scene where he basically razes his homestead to the ground, and the scene where he shoots the horse and the poor cow. Oh my goodness. And it's kind of seen through the perspective of other characters, isn't it? And in that particular scene, I think the emotional intensity is heightened because it's seen through the eyes of a child.
And everything is told from the point of view of the white people left behind. And so all of their prejudices, all of their assumptions come through. And obviously it felt interesting and original to explore white people's assumptions and incomprehension about why their black neighbors would suddenly up and leave this state. It's an unnamed state, it doesn't really exist. He's created it in order to explore this premise without tying it directly to a real geography.
Yeah. So there's quite a big cast of characters here, and there are lots of different points of view, but I felt like he handled that really well.
Oh, brilliantly. Yeah, I think so. It's quite a small little town where this kicks off, and Tucker Caliban was the servant, really, effectively, of the Wilson family. And the Wilson family are the descendants of General Dewey Wilson, who was a Confederate general. And Tucker Caliban is the descendant of this famous mythical slave called the African, who apparently was so huge that when he came off the boat, he was able to break free and run away, and then led a band of escaped slaves around the state, causing hell, until he was finally captured and killed, and his small infant child was left behind. And that child then is the ancestor of Tucker Caliban. And so that history of a family, because the Wilsons are shown to be very sympathetic. They're not perfect by any means, but in their own way, they love Tucker Caliban and his wife Bethra. And in their own way, Tucker Caliban and his wife love the Wilsons. But ultimately, I think this book shows that it's sort of impossible for them to remain together because the relationship is so unequal and so weighted by this horrible, horrible history.
And there's almost a sense to the white people, they're kind of okay with the status quo, even when they don't necessarily agree with it or support it, but it is what it is. And Tucker Caliban isn't able to live with it. Even from his early years, he was quite angry, or that comes across in his character, this kind of resentment and anger and frustration that's inside him, even though he's presented as a sort of good, decent, likable person. But nonetheless, there's this sort of inner rage and that then culminates in this act of renunciation. Yeah,
because of course we're talking about the fact that the Wilsons love Tucker Caliban, and yet there's this really haunting story about Tucker as a young boy. I think he was maybe 12, helping Dewey Wilson III, who at the time is about 5, learn how to ride a bike. And Dewey Wilson is saying, he's a child, he's naive. He's saying, Tucker, you must teach me how to ride a bike again. And he convinces Tucker Caliban to stay out later with him than he should. And it's not Dewey Wilson who gets whipped that night. When he goes back, it's Tucker. Yeah. And Tucker knows damn well he's going to get whipped.
Yeah, I remember that. That is quite sinister, isn't it, that whole scene?
And they bring it up later on. Dewey Wilson is now a young man, and he's gone to Harvard, and he has asked Tucker Caliban to write to him. And so Tucker has sent him a letter saying, do you remember that time when I helped you ride a bike?
Yeah.
And I don't think Tucker is bringing it up to make him feel badly, but obviously Tucker is constantly thinking about the impossibility of these relationships. They're so unequal.
Yeah. In a way that, for Dewey, it's hard to understand.
Yeah.
He doesn't really understand. I mean, none of the white people really understand why all the black people have decided to leave.
They're just oblivious. I mean, Dewey Wilson has just come back in his section, We haven't quite explained this, but in terms of the structure, every chapter is told from the perspective of a different white person left behind. So there's the local townspeople, some of whom are quite grimly racist. Then there's the Wilson family, and we hear from all of them, actually. We hear from Dewey Wilson, the son, who's in his early 20s. We hear from Dimphna, the daughter, who I think is maybe 17. And we hear from Camille Wilson, and we hear about her backstory with her husband, David Wilson, who is a complicated character. We might get to him.
Let's come on to him.
We'll come on to him.
I maybe have some issues with him.
And then Dewey Wilson gets to have a few different chapters. And it's when Dewey Wilson is coming back from Harvard, right at the time that Tucker Caliban has done this. And he arrives at the train station, and he doesn't notice that he is surrounded by black people, because Tucker Caliban has already created this chain of events where every black person is leaving. A peaceful grassroots movement. They're just leaving, taking all of their possessions and leaving. And Dewey Wilson just doesn't notice. No, because, why would he? In its own way, he is blind to the black people around him, except for the small few people who have grown up alongside him.
I did think for the most part that telling the story from the perspective of these different characters worked very well. I particularly liked it when you saw it through the eyes of the young boy, Mr. Leland, as he's slightly strangely called. And I felt like that was almost a bit like evoking To Kill a Mockingbird. It had that same sense of a child trying to make sense of the things that they see around them and the things that the adults are telling them. And I thought that worked brilliantly. Camille Wilson, when he tells the story from her perspective, I actually thought that was incredibly convincing, given that it had been written by a man. But David Wilson, I just found a bit confusing, because there's a sort of slight mystery to him, because first you hear from the wife's point of view, you hear from Camille, and she recounts this narrative of this hole in her marriage, this mysterious, he'd gone from being this very loving, very connected individual to suddenly being remote, reclusive, grumpy, something going on. She thought maybe it was an affair, but she never really knew. She decided to wait, and so she waited and waited, and then one day he sort of somehow comes back to her. And
20 years later.
Yeah. And then when you get his story, I sort of thought, great, now I'm going to make sense of all of this. And actually his story is a kind of strange one, connecting up with a friend he made in college who was black and their relationship, and then that other figure comes back into the story in a different way. And then why does he come back to her at the end? Like, why is everything okay again?
So I think that is because Tucker Calaban has left. Yeah.
But
so
why does that make things better?
It's because of his bloody white guilt. You know, it's just that he sells the land to Tucker Calaban to have his own farm.
Yes.
And in doing so, we talked a bit about this. We're like, you know, it's not an act of kindness. He does it to appease his own guilt about this relationship with Tucker Calaban and his wife. Again, it's just so toxic. They're like family, but they're not family. And then when Tucker rejects it all, he salts his fields, he breaks down the family heirloom clock, which David Wilson's grandfather would have given to Tucker Calaban's grandfather as a sign of love and affection for his slave. And he rejects it all and says, no, I don't want any of that. And I think it's supposed to be that moment of severing ties with the past that somehow frees David Wilson up. It's all quite... I think for me, I think it's brilliant, but I think you sort of have to read it almost as an allegory sometimes,
yes.
Right? It's very symbolic.
Well, and it's funny because to you this seems like a positive, whereas to me I think this is one of the things I found a bit frustrating about this book. I felt like, yes, this is a parable. I don't want to read parables. I kind of want to read...
but there's enough in there. There's
because I feel like
moments.
It's a way of almost like not having to explain things that slightly irritates me, because I don't always want to have things explained, but I do like to be able to connect the dots, and sometimes I feel like this whole thing about it's a metaphor, it's a parable. It's like allows writers to just say, I'll just put this in there.
But I don't think that's fair on the writer. I think that's our own ignorance. You know, we have not been raised on American history.
No, that's true.
We are not steeped in African American experience, definitely,
yeah.
And also not African American history. So our inability to understand some of the things that are happening here, that's kind of on us. That's not on the author, I would say. You mentioned that Camille Wilson you found very believable. It was funny. Phil, the one man in the book club, was like, I thought his portrayal of the women was anachronistic and misogynistic. And all the women in the group were like, no, not at all. And I see what he was saying. Basically, Phil was like, there's a lot of stand by your man. These women just think they're there to comfort the men and to try and make them better. And we're like, yes, but that's not... on the author. Again, that like feels true to how these women would have felt their purpose in life was.
Yeah, I didn't question it.
It was sad, it was depressing, but it felt very true and valid. And Bethra doesn't continue on to university as she planned.
Yeah.
Instead, she marries Tucker Calaban and has 2 children in short succession.
Yeah.
Or one and another on the way.
Although you never know what happens to them. You know, they leave. And one of the frustrations about this book is that they leave and then it's really just all about their absence. And the trouble is, you're kind of quite invested in these characters. So, you want to know, well, what happened to them? Where did they go? What kind of lives did they manage to make for themselves?
So one of the characters actually does appear in Kelly's later book. Not Tucker Calaban and his wife, but one of the characters who I think Mr. Leyland, the child, speaks to as he's leaving town. He ends up in Kelly's later novel, which is set, I think, in New York.
Yeah.
So he does weave in these threads. But I thought... there was no way he could explain what was going to happen because this incredible act of defiance wouldn't make things better for them. And I mean, we're going to move on to If Beale Street Could Talk, set in Harlem, New York. They were just trading one type of incredibly harsh racism for another. A very, very different reference, but I thought about Elizabeth Gaskell's novels. You know, she wrote Condition of England novels about the working class in Manchester in the 19th century. And when she didn't know what to do with a character because the situation was so bleak, they usually left and went to Canada. Right? She was like, I don't know what to do. You know, there's really no hope. They're going to stay working in a mill for the rest of their lives and die. I've kind of painted this scene. I know what I'll do. They'll emigrate to Canada or the United States, and then great, I don't need to think about them anymore, and the reader is satisfied.
Yeah.
I don't want to be critical of Kelly because I do think this is more of a symbolic allegory than anything. But there is a sense that this community and black people in the state leave and depart, and that in itself is all that matters, even though their lives are not going to be much easier wherever they land.
Yeah. I mean, to go back to the mechanics of it, I hadn't realised that he was so young when he wrote it. I mean, 23, that's extraordinary to write such an assured, beautiful prose. In many ways, it's a wonderfully written book, but I do feel there are a few flaws. There's a dramatic scene when the preacher comes back in this limousine. He's a sort of very visible figure of affluence and success. And he comes back in this smart car and tours around the countryside trying to figure out why Tucker Caliban's act has led to this mass exodus. And then in a dramatic scene sort of closer to the end, he is set upon by people of the town. And again, I understood why it was an important scene. I understood why it needed to happen. And I felt like I understood the point he was trying to make. But just the mechanics of it were like, why did the chauffeur stop? He didn't need to stop. Why would he stop?
I did think that too. I was like, are you really going to stop for a mob of impoverished white men in a state where all the black people have just left?
And so just to go back to, I do accept there's a certain extent to which, yes, the onus is on me to sort of stretch my reach a little bit to understand it. But at the same time, sometimes just the writing, you're like, come on, you know.
That said, violence is notably absent from this entire book until the end.
Apart from the poor horse and the cow. Sorry, I just can't forget them.
I feel like this really matters to you because you grew up on a farm. I was like, didn't notice it at all myself, I gotta say. It was sharp and short, and we eat meat, Kate.
Oh my goodness. The way the cow, it gets shot in the head, it doesn't realise it's still running around, and then it collapses. Dramatic final toppling over. Oh my goodness.
We felt, yes, it was symbolic, but equally it felt like Reverend T. Bradshaw, the character, wanted his death to be symbolic. You know, he was very disillusioned by the fact that...
Yeah, so if he'd been driving, that would have worked fine. That would be my little tweak there.
Maybe he yelled stop. You know, maybe that's what you need to make. Maybe he, in the back of his limousine, he yelled stop to the driver to say, you know, leave me to my fate.
Well, in the book, supposedly the driver stops because he's worried because someone runs out chasing the car. He's worried that he's hit something or that he's done something, but it wasn't enough. All right, so in conclusion then, I'm getting the impression it was a really good book club book.
It was such a good book club book. And even still, when I've seen some of my friends afterwards, they're like, I can't believe that we never heard of that book before. I think it is a classic and it should be read. And it's such a pleasure and an enlightening read.
Yeah, it was good. It was a good discovery. I am very glad I read it.
And a perfect compliment then to James Baldwin, If Beale Street Could Talk. And just to jump straight in, I feel like The Different Drummer feels like a beautifully constructed parable, whereas If Beale Street feels like an incredibly well-crafted documentary of a slice of real life as it would have been lived in 1960s Harlem.
Yes. So
very different books.
We picked this up because of the BAFTA nominations. I think it won a BAFTA or an Oscar. I can't remember now. But anyway, you know, we'd all seen the clips of the film and everyone was like, oh, you know, James Baldwin. We'd never read him. So it was as good a reason as any to dip in, and we picked this one. It's a story set in Harlem, the black soul of New York City in the era of Aretha Franklin and Ray Charles. The narrator of James Baldwin's novel is Tish, 19 and pregnant. Her lover, Fonnie, father of her child, is in jail. Flashbacks from their love affair are woven into the compelling struggle of two families to win justice for Fonnie. To this love story, Baldwin brings a spare and impassioned intensity, charging it with universal resonance and power. Now, I've missed a little bit of that blurb on the back because there's kind of a massive plot spoiler in here. One of the really interesting things about this novel is the way that it's structured. You know that Fonnie is in jail, But it takes quite a long time before the revelation actually comes about why he's in jail and what he's been accused of. It's very good because what it sort of means is that you get to know these characters quite well and become quite invested in them, and then you find out the events that lead to the situation that they're all in. I was just going to read a little bit just to give you a sense of his writing. So this is kind of around the midsection of the book, and it's Tish who is struggling with her situation. She goes to visit Fonny in jail every so often, and then she comes away always upset by the intense emotions. That night I dreamed. I dreamed all night. I had terrible dreams. In one of those dreams, Fonny was driving a truck, a great big truck, very fast, too fast, down the highway, and he was looking for me. But he didn't see me. I was behind the truck, calling out his name, but the roar of the motor drowned my voice. There were 2 turnings off this highway, and they both looked exactly alike. The highway was on a cliff above the sea. One of the turnings led to the driveway of our house. The other led to the cliff's edge and a drop straight down to the sea. He was driving too fast, too fast. I called his name as loud as I could, and as he began to turn the truck, I screamed again and woke up. The light was on, and Sharon was standing above me. I cannot describe her face. She had brought in a cold, wet towel, and she wiped my brow and my neck. She leaned down and kissed me. Then she straightened and looked into my eyes. I know I can't help you very much right now. God knows what I wouldn't give if I could. But I know about suffering, if that helps. I know that it ends. I ain't going to tell you no lies, like it always ends for the better. Sometimes it ends for the worst. You can suffer so bad that you can be driven to a place where you can't ever suffer again. And that's worse. She took both my hands and held them tightly between her own. Try to remember that. And the only way anything ever gets done is when you make up your mind to do it. I know a lot of our loved ones, a lot of our men have died in prison, but not all of them. You remember that. And you ain't really alone in that bed, Tish. You've got that child beneath your heart, and we're all counting on you. Fonny's counting on you to bring that child here safe and well. You're the only one who can do it, but you're strong. Lean on your strength. So Sharon is her mother. So there's a lot of things that are wonderful about this book. I think the main thing is this family. You know, there's Tish and then there's Fonny, and so there's a relationship and this love story between them. But it's Tish's family, her mother, her sister Ernestine, who's a very powerful character who kind of leaps off the page, and the father, and they're all in their different ways trying to help resolve this situation and to try and help get Fonny out of jail. And they've got a lawyer, but the odds are massively stacked against them because the law is corrupt. It's sort of trumped up charges, and yet they don't have the means to really fight them.
Well, even if they had the means, they wouldn't win. That's what makes me so angry.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really important book to read because it was written in the 60s. And if you are a naive, white, privileged person like myself, it's quite eye-opening. I mean, I feel stupid saying it, but it's quite eye-opening to read and to think this shit has been happening for hundreds of years and it's still happening, and that's why the Black Lives Movement is so important.
Yeah, I think one of the things we talked about was how relevant it feels, how contemporary in some ways.
You hope it is better today. You hope that if you do have the means to fight it now, you would have more success.
Well,
but certainly lots of people don't have the means to fight it, and the odds are stacked against them.
There's an interesting film called I Am Not Your Negro that I watched after this because I didn't really know anything about James Baldwin. And so in a way, I think there was a great pleasure in reading this book, but also then getting a sense of him. And he was such an interesting man. And this film takes notes that he wrote for a project where he wanted to explore the deaths of his friends, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Medgar Evers. 3 significant men in his life who all, for various reasons, were gunned down. And it explores his almost gathering of evidence to prove this existential threat that exists for black people in this system that they live in and they're a part of, and yet has been created and the parameters have always been set by white people, and how kind of hopeless and futile it can seem to struggle against that. And interestingly, he threw up his hands, and much like the characters in A Different Drummer, he decided to leave. He went to live in Paris, and I think he ended his days down in the south of France, which seemed kind of strange to me. I was like, well, why did he end up there? But people in my book club were like, oh no, it was kind of like this big jazz scene.
And I think the difference is that in France, there would have been racists, but there wouldn't have been institutionalized racism.
Yeah.
I've been reading about that a lot recently. I think tied to Brexit a little bit, but just saying, you know, it's not that individuals are necessarily racist, it's that the institutions and the systems that exist continue to be racist. And if you kind of embrace and support those institutions, you are supporting racism. So it's making that nuance much more clear in everyone's minds. It's not just about disliking someone because of the color of their skin. It's much more about the systems that are in place to hold them back. And I think in France, they wouldn't have been there. So you know what? People probably were racist to James Baldwin, but the police weren't out to get him simply because of the color of his skin.
Yeah.
Or maybe less so. You probably don't know this. Important to flag, William Melvin Kelly also left. He was in Paris for a few years and then he ended up in Jamaica with his family.
Ah, yes.
And I think if Beale Street Could Talk makes really clear why, if you had the means, you would leave the country because you're not safe.
And yet I think what's interesting as well is that, you know, he left and yet he remained throughout his life engaged and in his writing and through his work. And this film was based on a proposal he wrote towards the end of his life, and it uses his words and it has archive footage of people from back in the 1950s, 1960s, and yet interspersed with this is footage of contemporary things, the Rodney King beating, more recent protests that have been going on, and it's sort of making the point that his words ring as true now as they did then. There's an eloquence to him. If you see him speak, as you do in this film, there are quite long clips of him just debating with people and talking. There's a very dramatic scene of him standing at, must be the Oxford Union or something. You know, he obviously came over, and his words are so moving and so powerful, and yet delivered in this kind of laconic, slightly dry tone, not cynicism, but a weariness and a knowledge that things are what they are. And he didn't really see any possibility of them changing.
And depressingly, they haven't that much.
Well, he couldn't see that it would be ever possible to have a black man as president. And I wonder what that would have meant to him, knowing that in fact that thing had come to pass. But then, as we know, the subsequent events almost make it more depressing that happened, because the wheel kind of shooting back the other way has been so dramatic and so powerful. It makes you, it's just bewildering. You think, well, I thought things had changed, but perhaps they hadn't changed. It's that thing, though, going back to William Kelly, about the only way that they can rationalise their loss is to make out that it wasn't a loss at all. You know, these townspeople, you know, when they're talking about, well, it doesn't matter, you know, we don't need them. It's that kind of thing. And again, it's the sense of, well, this progress, you know, it wasn't really progress, was it? We reject it. We didn't need it. It's not important.
Alice in my book club, Alice H., wrote her master's thesis, I think, on James Baldwin. And she, as we were discussing William Melvin Kelly, brought up this line, and I think we're paraphrasing here, but James Baldwin apparently said, "You always need someone lower than you. So we create black people, we create women."
Yeah, nice to get women in there.
Yeah, well,
I have to say, he was really great for a good line. I mean, I made so many notes just from the film. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. You know, this idea of somehow trying to make people see the situation, this sort of blindness that the white ruling class have, you know, people who wouldn't necessarily define themselves as racist. And yet, as you say, by continuing to live and exist in these systems that have been set up that make a society so unequal and so divisive, and not to be trying to break out or change those systems in any way, but to tacitly accept the status quo, because people ultimately are concerned with the things that are very immediate to them. They're concerned with their jobs and their families and their health and getting a new car, and people don't look at the bigger picture. And I feel like his big project was to try and make people look. There's a kind of emotional intensity to this book that someone commented it almost felt a bit intrusive reading it. You know, the intimacy, the scenes between Tish and Fonny, which is quite powerful, like makes you slightly sit back writing.
It's quite a visceral losing one's virginity scene.
That is the scene.
All right.
That is the scene that I'm thinking of. Yep. I wasn't going to read that one out. But yeah, which is good, you know. I think that was a good thing. Andy commented that it was almost like a play, like a piece of theatre. And once he'd said that, I could really see that. You know, you can almost imagine it being staged with sort of a black surround and, you know, sort of 4 people on chairs in the centre. It had that almost sense of a sort of sharp focus and an intensity that's quite sustained. That, again, I think we thought was good, we liked.
Interesting. Yeah, I do think it is good. it's not the type of novel, that hyper-realism isn't the type of thing I usually enjoy reading.
Yeah.
And I did find it quite slow, even though obviously when I finished it, it felt very important to have read it. Well, it felt very powerful.
And I think it's this thing, isn't it, about the teaser, why? What is going on? Like, why is it like that? And it takes quite a long time for that reveal. And I think perhaps that does then contribute to this sense of almost like discursiveness, like where is it going?
Yeah, and which is very powerful because by the time you find out why Fonny is in jail, you're furious.
Yeah.
You're so angry.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We sort of felt a little bit like it's slightly uneven in tone. Sometimes the language and the conversations between people, I talked about this emotional intensity. It's almost like sometimes it goes a bit too far, and that jarred some people. They found that a bit unsettling. I think Amanda summed it up best. She said it's a novel where really you want to dwell on its strengths rather than its weaknesses. It's not that the flaws aren't there, but overall, there was so much more to it. And I think also, perhaps not so much to see this novel in isolation, but as part of a body of work. I mean, if it left me with anything, it left me with the feeling that I would like to read more of him. And I'm pleased to have encountered him. And I'm just curious and want to know more about this beautiful writer who had such an important and impassioned point of view.
I feel like we could talk for ages, but we should probably wrap up and just say 2 amazing books.
Yeah.
And fantastic book club books.
Yeah, they were good book club books.
I mean, if you were feeling ambitious, you could read both of them in one group.
They're not long. Yeah, I think actually in a way they would be really good companion books. Perhaps if you're going to read him, I wonder if this is the one. I don't know. Perhaps it's something to debate with your own book club and look into his sort of back catalogue a bit more. But certainly, yeah, as a sort of introduction to him, and a good, well-crafted, thought-provoking novel. Yeah, why not?
And if Beale Street could talk, here are some recommendations for your next book club book.
So I was going to take us back to The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead.
Which I mentioned in passing.
Which was a really good book club book, was it not?
It was a really good book club book.
Was it your book club or my book club?
Yeah, it was my book.
That's the trouble when we look back, because I'm so invested in your ones, I can't remember.
It was a particularly good book club book because it was divisive.
Yeah.
And divisive mainly because I didn't think it was all that great, and the rest of my book club thought it was thought-provoking and strong and everything that the awards had made it out to be.
So it tells the story of Cora, who is a slave on a cotton plantation in Georgia, where life is hellish under abusive white owners. And when Caesar, who's a recent arrival, tells her about something called the Underground Railroad, she decides to take a terrifying risk with him and escape. But things don't go the way that they had planned, and although they do manage to find a station and head north, they are being hunted.
And you need to say a bit more about that station.
So Colson Whitehead's sort of clever thing that he does is that he's taken the metaphorical idea of the Underground Railroad and made it into a real physical functioning thing. And so they literally find the station and manage to get onto the train and then are taken to different states, and those states sort of seem like they might be real places, but in fact you start to realize are almost like parallel imaginings of the might have beens, the what ifs, what if things have gone this way in this state, all with the point of bringing you back, I think, to considering history and the way that it has impacted on the lives of black people, but sort of packaged up in this quite thrilling adventure story as well. Very well told, yeah, lots to dig into and debate. So that was the obvious thing that came to mind. But then I thought also, Rennie Edo Lodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Funny enough, we haven't actually done this for my book club, but we have spent a considerable portion of one evening talking about it, because some of us have read it. I bought it a while back, and it's just a really interesting, honest, in the same way as Baldwin, a kind of wake-up call. It's a cri de coeur. It's saying, look at the situation, understand what black people are facing and what we live with in our day-to-day lives, and understand how that matters and what a difference it makes. Don't look away, in a way. We had an interesting discussion actually about, can we talk about this? Can we discuss this? We're not black. No one in my book club is black. Do we have a right to say anything? And I don't know, but I think surely it's good to have conversations, and I think it's good to be reading things that make you ask questions and look at yourself and look at people around you, and maybe just notice things in a way that you wouldn't have noticed them before. And I think Renée Lodge, it's a very provocative book, but in the best way. It's sort of every page makes you sit up slightly. It says on the back, the book that sparked a national conversation. And I think for a book that's really going to ignite debate, and it's well written too, it's good. So that would be my other recommendation.
That sounds really good. UK as well.
Yes, UK based as well. Interesting, yes, because so often, when we think about race relations, our minds immediately turn to America. And actually, this is a very specific look at what happens in this country.
Yeah.
And
I definitely feel like I need to read that.
He's got a good perspective.
We talked a little bit in book club just about allies. I'm not sure if you even know this as a term, but people identifying as allies to marginalized groups. And often this happens online. You can say I'm an ally of XYZ movement. I'm an ally of the LGBTQ community. And of course, that seems good in principle, but apparently it's also quite problematic because it can just be virtue signaling. Who are you to really, as you say, kind of speak on behalf of any group where you have no experience of their experiences?
Yeah.
So it is really, really tricky. And I think that's why we started this whole podcast saying we feel unequal to the task. But I suppose you have to start somewhere. Otherwise, we just all live in our little silos and be totally ignorant.
Well, and I think also, I didn't realise when I read A Different Drummer, I noticed your book has a picture of him inside the front cover, but I read mine on the Kindle, and I didn't realise that he was black.
Really?
I know, that's really silly of me, isn't it? Because
when I not necessarily.
Well, and then at the end I read the little blurb about him, and I was just like, oh, of course. The point I wanted to make was just that, when we read things, the colour of the skin of the author is not something that you would ever even consider. And I thought maybe that was important, that through books and through reading, we can hear people's voices and we can understand them, and hopefully we can set aside our preconceptions because we don't necessarily even know. And does that matter? I don't think it should matter, or because then you're really purely listening to what they have to say and the points they're trying to make, and maybe that's a good thing.
I hope it's a good thing.
I don't know.
The book I was going to recommend is Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Oh, I want to read that one.
I listened to it and I'd highly recommend listening to it. It's only 155 pages. It's a slim little book, which means on Audible it's 2-3 hours.
Yeah.
And it's read by Coates himself. And because the structure is a letter that he's written to his teenage son about the colour of his skin and the fact that the world around him will judge him as black because of the colour of his skin. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, I think, is building on a long, long discussion around ideas of race, which James Baldwin, was very much a part of. And this idea that race is invented, that the colour of our skin matters, it's entirely a social construct. It's a very moving book, and it was my book club book, and it led to a great discussion.
Yeah.
And I think would be a brilliant follow-on to any of the books that we've just discussed.
Well, and I think he was directly inspired, wasn't he, by something James Baldwin wrote. I think James Baldwin wrote a book of essays, and I think that's what led Ta-Nehisi Coates to think it's time to do this again. I need to update this for this generation.
And I almost wonder if Between the World and Me could be a James Baldwin quote. It feels like it, doesn't it?
Well, and he was, as I said before, he was just a great one at, nailing it with a good line.
Those books all sound quite serious. I should say Between the World and Me is actually a really interesting, beautiful read. It's not heavy going. None of these books are. Well, I can't speak for why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, but A Different Drummer is a real page turner.
Yeah.
The structure keeps you engaged, keeps you going.
Yeah, and the intensity to If Beale Street Could Talk. And I think Renée Lodge, it's sort of sparky and conversational and provocative, and in the same way, yeah, absolutely keeps you turning the pages.
But maybe for something a little bit lighter, a little bit funny, The Sellout by Paul Beatty.
Our first podcast.
Our very first podcast, and a fantastic book. I would like to think we're better read and more knowledgeable now than we were discussing that book 2-3 years ago.
Maybe.
I
remember that book as kind of a game changer because it's quite confusing in lots of ways. There's a lot you're kind of reaching for. Again, I think we talked earlier about not necessarily having the background. And so this is set in LA, isn't it? And it's a man who is prosecuted for
reinstating slavery.
That's right.
A black man.
I was going to say owning a slave, but yeah.
A black man who has decided to reinstate slavery.
And in this case, the fact is that the slave in question wants to be a slave, and they've come to an arrangement so that he can basically keep this man happy. But it opens up all of these really, really interesting questions. It's a very sharp, sideways take on something that we think we know, and then he brings this kind of amazing perspective to it.
And it's quite funny.
And it is quite
Even
funny.
when you are a bit at sea in the cultural references
Yeah.
to LA hip-hop and everything else.
And again, that was my book club that did that one, and it was a really good book club book. It was a good debate book. So yeah, Paul Beatty. So I've gone from worrying slightly that I couldn't think of anything to recommend to thinking, oh my goodness, there are so many books to recommend that you know, feed in really well to these
and
ideas.
so many brilliant books.
Yeah, and so many. That's true, isn't it? It's so easy to think of good books that would relate to this. Beloved. I was wondering about the Essie Adegwin, Washington Black, which I haven't read, but I was thinking, I wonder if that would be...
Actually, I was thinking about Homegoing, which I read recently. That's one of the reasons I pick on the Underground Railroad, because it was published the same year as Homegoing. And I think Homegoing is a way better novel, but it got given a gendered flowery cover and didn't get taken all that seriously by the awards.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so I think we could go on and on, but let's draw it to a close and leave it there. That's all for this episode. On our next book club show, we'll be discussing Booker Prize-winning novel Milkman by Anna Burns. Set in an unnamed city, it's a place where to stand out from the crowd is dangerous. Middle sister is trying to keep secrets about her maybe boyfriend and her occasional encounters with a man known as Milkman. But in a small, closed community, secrets are hard to keep. It's a tale of gossip and hearsay, silence and deliberate deafness. It's the story of inaction with enormous consequences. But did it make for a good book club read? Read along with us and find out.
And if you haven't already, do check out our latest bookshelf episode where we discuss what we've been reading outside of book club and see if there's any gems in there for your next book club read. Also have a listen to our interview with Simon Thomas from the podcast Tea or Books. He told us about his Book of the Year Club, which specialises in seeking out books from the past.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
But for now, thanks for listening and a happy reading.